Last time I took a look at several stories based across the Dune universe, but now I look at even more with Sands of Dune. Let's get into the video. Welcome back to BG's Books. I'm Mr. BG, and today I am going to review Sands of Dune by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson. So similar to the last video I did a review for Sands of Dune, or not Sands of Dune, this is Sands of Dune, Tales of Dune last time, where there were 8 stories set across the various different times of Dune, which were the Butlerian Jihad period, the Dune period, or the time of Paul Atreides, and after the Scattering, which is post-Book 4. But anyway, so Sands of Dune has 4 stories this time, and 3 of them are set around the time of Paul Atreides, and then 1 is before, and we'll get into that when we get into that. But so yeah, there are 4 stories in there, and I just gotta say, I found these stories more interesting than the ones in Tales of Dune. I don't know if it was because the Tales stories were just like not as long as these ones and not as fleshed out, but I enjoyed these ones a lot more. I actually remember a lot more of them than I do in Tales. But, so yeah, anyway, yeah, there are 4 stories in here, and let's get right into the stories. So the first story on our list is The Edge of a Crysknife. So basically, this story takes place 56 years before the first Dune novel, and it follows Shadow Mapes. I don't remember if I mentioned Shadow Mapes in my Dune review or not, but basically, when the Atreides got to Arrakis, she was kind of their, like, housekeeper and stuff. She gave Lady Jessica the crysknife, and this is kind of the story of that. So basically, 56 years before the events of Dune, the Shadow Mapes is a Fremen soldier kind of doing raids against Harkonnens with her husband Rafir and some other Fedaykin friends. And then, long story short, her mother is also like the Reverend Mother of the Sietch. Her name is Safia. And so basically Safia is just like, yeah, keep doing what you're doing. Yeah, let's just stick it to those Harkonnens. Yeah. So basically this first little half of the story there is basically just like Shadow Mapes and her husband and the Fedaykin just kind of doing stuff. And then eventually, you know, this leads to Rafir and the rest of his men getting captured. And then eventually, Mapes decides to infiltrate the Harkonnens by becoming their housekeeper and then, like, learning all their secrets and stuff. But long story short, like I said, Rafir and his men get captured and they eventually get executed. But what the Harkonnens don't know is that Mapes is actually pregnant with Rafir's son. So part 2 happens, and then 17 years have passed. The son is now grown. His name is Samos. And so basically this part, which I think is the more interesting part, is just Mapes, Samos, and some more Fremen leading an attack against the Harkonnens by summoning a sandworm to just go through a spice factory. And so that's kind of it. Unfortunately, Samos does die in the process. Samos. But, yeah, basically, Mapes gets revenge on the Harkonnens for killing her husband. Her son, unfortunately, passes. But this does lead to her getting the crysknife, which her mother gave her, that she gives to Lady Jessica later on in Dune. And this is just kind of her introduction into what eventually leads her into becoming the Atreides housekeeper. Anyway, they're going up against Dimitri Harkonnen, who's, like, I think the Baron's brother, and then, of course, after Dimitri, like, resigns or gets killed or something, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen steps in, and so that's how that ends. And then the second story we have is Blood of the Sardaukar. So I mentioned that Edge of the Crysknife takes place about many decades before Dune, but this one actually takes place during Dune. So similar to my favorite story from Tales of Dune, which is Waters of Caladan, or the Seas of Caladan. This takes place during the raid on Arrakeen, you know, the attack on House Atreides, when the Atreides are betrayed by Dr. Yueh and stuff. And so basically this goes over the life of a Sardaukar soldier named Japati. It's kind of like going into his early life on how he got inducted into the Sardaukar and stuff. And then also his men are trying to take down Duncan, Idaho. And long story short, Duncan, Idaho fights his way through the Sardaukar and escapes on an ornithopter. Because if you remember, in the second part of Dune, Paul and Jessica have like landed in the desert. They're stranded. And then Duncan comes out of nowhere in an ornithopter and saves them. So this kind of explains that scene in the book where he gets the ornithopter and then leaves. So I thought that was very interesting. I definitely think that you could read this while reading Dune, although the exact timeline with this and Seas of Caladan versus Dune, they both happen around the same time. So I wouldn't recommend it. Just read one thing at a time, but you could do that. All right, and then here we have the third story, which is also my favorite one of this collection, called The Waters of Canley. So parts 2 and 3 of Dune, like the original Dune book, are 2 years apart. So part 3 takes place 2 years after parts 1 and 2 of Dune. And so this takes place 1 year after part 2 and 1 year before part 3. So it's like right in the middle of parts 2 and 3 of Dune. And it follows Gurney Halleck. He's one of the Atreides soldiers. And basically, since House Atreides fell, the Duke is dead. Paul and Jessica are presumed dead. He hasn't met up with them yet. Anyway, so he's just kind of living life as a spice smuggler with some of the spice smugglers of Arrakis. But they have a plan to really stick it to the Beast Raban, who, is a Harkonnen. And so basically what Gurney plans is to kind of lead an attack on the Spacing Guild where there's a tank full of water and stuff that Raban is expecting on Arrakis because, water is like very important to Arrakis and stuff. And so basically they're trying to get this tank and destroy it because if Raban doesn't get that water, that'll be like a major blow to the Harkonnens, that'll be a major blow. So anyway, what happens is that they get to the tank, and then while they're doing stuff, they get attacked, and they almost all get killed. So like Gurney and his men escape, and then some of the other Fremen spice smugglers escape, and then back on the ground, what few of them are left, they just like get really mad at Gurney. They're like, "You almost cost us all of our men, so we should not have done that. You are stupid right now." And then Gurney's like, "I don't care about that." And so what he does is that after he leaves them, he walks over to where Raban is stationed. But this is something that Gurney didn't tell them. The plan, or at least the plan that Gurney made it seem like, was that they were going to destroy the tank. But of course, the tank was recovered anyway, and it was taken to Raban. But what Gurney didn't tell them was that he actually poisoned the water in the tank so that when all of Raban's soldiers start drinking the water, they get poisoned and die. And then Gurney's like, "Yeah, I did it." So yeah, that's just a really fun side story about what happened between the 2 years between parts 2 and 3 of Dune, because that part isn't really explored a whole lot. It's mostly just like either before, after, or like during the Battle of Arrakeen of Dune. So I kind of like that it wasn't during the Battle of Arrakeen. It was kind of like in between some of the stuff, which I thought was very interesting. And then, of course, our last story here is Imperial Court. So Imperial Court actually takes place like hundreds of years before the actual Dune timeline. So, much before Paul Atreides. And then this is shortly after Navigators of Dune, I believe, which is in the Schools trilogy, which is like after the Butlerian Jihad period. Anyway, so Imperial Court, basically the main guy of House Carino, like the Emperor of House Carino, has died, and so his son or some sort of heir took over, and then he's looking for a new council chamberlain. And so this one guy named Willem Atreides really wants to be council chamberlain, so he kind of applies for that. But this other guy named Danvis Harkonnen also wants to. And of course, the Harkonnens and the Atreides, they just naturally hate each other and stuff, right? So, yeah, basically, Danvis devises a plan to frame Willem for murder with his cousin Gerhard. And so basically, Danvis is poisoned and then will die and stuff. Anyway, long story short, Danvis doesn't actually die, but he does get, like, permanently just, like, changed. He's, like, in a wheelchair now or something. But the other candidates die. Willem is blamed for it. So not only is he just like out of the running for being the next council chamberlain, but Gerhardt accuses him of murder because remember, Danvers is supposed to be dead. And then he murders Willem. And so Willem's family that have come from a different planet, they're just like, we just got to take him back. This place isn't good for us anymore. So anyway, I just thought this story was really interesting. It's probably my least favorite, though, just because it's kind of so disconnected from the other ones. It's like at least Edge of a Crysknife. It's like a couple decades or like a few decades before Dune. And then Imperial Court is like a few thousand years before Dune. So... yeah, I mean, this one wasn't my favorite, but it certainly was interesting overall. I found all these stories interesting overall. And yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on the whole matter. Alright, so quickly before I get into my thoughts on Sands of Dune, I do want to quickly explain what a Canley is, because I forgot to explain it earlier. Basically, a Canley in the Dune universe means, like, revenge from a blood feud. So, like, of course, we know the Atreides and the Harkonnens have a blood feud that goes back for several generations. And so, basically, when someone calls a Canley, that's basically saying, I vow revenge against you, and stuff. So, like in Imperial Court, when Gerhard claimed a Canley against Willem Atreides for killing Danvers, he was claiming revenge for a blood feud. And then later when Gurney Halleck was doing a Canley on Raban for the fall of House Atreides, that was a revenge for the blood feud. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to briefly explain that real quick. Anyway, so I thought Sands of Dune was very interesting. It was a very fun series of novellas and short stories and stuff. And unlike Tales of Dune, which has a lot more stories in there, not only does Sands just not have as much, but they're also like longer, so they're more fleshed out and more interesting and more character development and stuff. So it's like, yeah, I think that this is probably the better, like, Brian and Kevin Dune book to start with than Tales is, I believe. Because if you remember my Tales video, I couldn't really remember any of the stories outside of a select few. But, like, with Sands, I remembered basically every story almost, like, pretty decently well. So, yeah, I will say that it is certainly interesting seeing Shadow Mapes actually have a character outside of her basically glorified cameo that she had in the first Dune book. I like seeing how the Harkonnens, the Atreides, started feuding in the first place. I like seeing the Sardaukar perspective from the raid on Arrakeen during the fall of House Atreides. And of course, I love seeing what Gurney Halleck was up to during the 2 years between Dune Parts 2 and 3. So I thought that was very interesting as well. And so, yeah, all around, Sands of Dune is just a really fine collection, and I think that if you are starting to branch off from Frank's Dunes and want to get into one of Brian and Kevin's Dunes, I think Sands is like the perfect way to start. It's not overwhelming, it's not too long, and I think you'll be able to understand it pretty well, even if you have not read most of the other Dune books that come before it like I have. So, anyway, yeah, go read Sands of Dune. But that is it for the video, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this review for Sands of Dune by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson. Please let me know of any more books you want me to review down in the comments below, or just talk anything about Dune. You guys know I love Dune around here. But anyway, yeah, that is the end of the video. That has been it from me. I've been Mr. BG. This has been BG's Books. And
here's some water, buddy.
Hey, thanks. Thanks.
I poisoned it.
You what?